Anyway, so the point is that especially for some of the concerns that Gabriel has mentioned about wanting to understand more about where phenomenology comes from, the questions about idealism and Hegel that we went over last time, relations of any of these things to questions of existence and essentialism, and so forth. Even things about different ways of understanding Kantian thing in itself, because the background of most of the German philosophy that he's speaking to is kind of a neo-Kantian tradition in that Levinos is speaking to. That Husserl is speaking to. But the point is that Levinos is an interesting character in his own right. He's an important phenomenological philosopher in his own right in decades after Husserl. Basically 30s to 70s was his productive period. But he also is just a very clear teacher of Husserl, who he understands extremely well, right? He understands not only Husserl's arguments, but why they were influential in the philosophy of his day and why they created this whole thing that went in a different direction than the sort of Anglo-Saxon logical positivism movement of the 10s to 20s to 30s. I think this is just, it's a good intro to the, if I can put it this way, the founding of phenomenology as its own thing in the 20th century. I looked on Amazon. It is accessible. It's if you try to buy it from Amazon itself with Amazon fulfillment, it may be like they've only got one copy left or something, but there are plenty of used copies of it available. My own experience with Amazon is you buy them used on Amazon from a different person. It can take a little bit longer to get them. So I don't know if we would want to leave 3 weeks as opposed to 2 if we did this one. It's not that long a work. It's 150 pages, more or less, 160 if you count the introduction. Maybe. We would not try to do the whole thing in one go, though. But people would have to have it in hand, obviously, and a chance to read parts of it. Probably the first 3 sections. It's about 50, 60 pages, maybe only the first 2 sections. Anyway, I'm interested in whether or not people would be open to that. It sounds like, Joe, you would be. Craig, do you have any thoughts on interspersing a Levinos beside of Kierkegaard, or have you already started?
Hold up, I can see the title again.
It's available on Amazon. I just ordered it.
Okay.
$29 plus.
The theory of okay.
And I'm interested in it because I just started looking into Simon Critchley's The Ethics of Deconstruction.
Okay.
So, Derrida and Levinos. So I've danced around Levinos a lot, and Critchley's article was referenced in another article I really liked on complexity. So I'm up for trying to dig into it and go that direction. So let's say I already ordered it, $28.90 plus tax.
All right.
Big on Prime. So
great. Okay, so you guys want to make sure that Gabriel is also open to it, but I think he will be.
I still can't find it on Amazon.
So look for Levinos as the
spell
author.
That, please. Levinas.
Yep.
Okay, let me try that one. Let's see.
Makes the 11th.
Oh, here I finally found it. Just a second. Now I'm on the page. You can go on to talking about something because now I can.
Okay.
Ask it.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So I think that we would go through the introduction and the first 2 chapters when I say the introduction, I don't mean the translator's forward. We would skip that, or the forward of the second edition. You can skip that too. That's from Richard Cohen. But just go to Levinos's own introduction, which I guess is on, in this edition, they have these Roman numeral pages for all the front matter. And so on page LIII, like 53 of the front matter, is where Levinos's own introduction begins. And that's like 6 pages. And that's sort of his, preface of what he wants to cover in the whole book. There may be some parts of it which are a little bit hard to follow than the exposition itself that starts on page 1, just because, or page 3, just because it's, it may assume more, that you know more, but those 6 pages are worth reading. And then we would read chapter 1, which is the naturalistic theory of being and the method of philosophy. And then chapter 2, which is the phenomenological theory of being, the absolute existence of consciousness. So those 2 are sort of a good intro, and then we'll leave for the second session the phenomena of intentionality, or the idea of intentionality, and theoretical consciousness. So we would just be doing intro and first 2 chapters. That takes us basically down to page 36. So it's a relatively small reading. There'll take some time for the book to get to you, though. So yep. And you can go on to 3 if you want, but I want to cover 3 in its own section, 3 and 4 in its own session. Okay, but that's a plan for next time. We're 13 minutes after, and we still don't have Gabriel, so I don't know if he's going to be late or appear. We know we're not going to have Alex, so we probably should get going on our actual Gilson, right? So this was our last session on Gilson, knowledge of existence, being in existence, his own exposition of what he takes to be the teaching of Aquinas on all the topics he's brought up. And this is sort of where he's supposed to deliver on all the promises about how there's a better position on all these things. It's going to solve all the problems he's raised along the way, and we have to assess how well he does that. I do want to get you guys' reactions to all of it first, but just some layout of what we want to cover here. I want to make sure we have some reactions, and then I want to make sure we understand Gilson's positions in the sense of what he says is true about Aristotle and what he says about is true about Aquinas, and how he says Aquinas differs from Aristotle, and the position he's ascribing to Aquinas on different topics. And basically, I just want to first pass to be, let's be clear on what Gilson says, right, in the chapter, especially the first, the chapter 5 of it. And then we want to assess it in the sense of what do we think of his different arguments he makes in these different places, how well he carried out his own brief, and so on, right? So the point is, besides first reactions, we want to first just be clear on what is said in the chapter, and then we can talk about our assessments of what he did and didn't manage to do. And then after that, we might talk a little bit separately about the last chapter, the knowledge and existence chapter. And then at the end, after all of that, we can sum up our reactions to Gilson as a whole, since this is kind of our last section on Gilson. So first reactions to already reading the chapter, then we're going to be explaining what he says and clarifying any points that weren't clear about what he said. And then we can be assessing it a little bit on the last chapter and summing up what we think of Gilson and the case he's made as a whole. That's sort of my outline of how I imagine the topics we have to cover today goes. Okay, so with that said, first reactions to these 2 chapters, how hard were they? How clear were they? What'd you learn? Um, go ahead, Joe. You can jump in.
Well, I liked the way he seemed to be bringing together. Of course, you were foreshadowing this by previous discussions, bringing together this whole issue of essence versus existence and how they could be related and things like that. And I think he came up with a sort of interesting convergence idea to make a compound. You know, some of this terminology just escapes me because I'm sure it's technical. I'm sure that you know, I couldn't possibly repeat it with great precision. But I like the way it was presented. I thought it made sense. I could see that he was a big follower of Aquinas, especially since I looked further into the back of the book, and I can see that he's really seems to be discussing this whole book with a couple of other Jesuits who are making some other very interesting and obscure points about, you know, how Aristotle used words and how Aquinas uses words and how Gilson's using words. And so Gilson was defending himself for using loosey and goosey Aquinas terms.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, that I don't mind because I'm not an Aquinas scholar. I just want to see what the divine scholar. What was the name again? Somebody called him the divine
doctor usually.
Yeah.
The angelic doctor is the usual term.
The angelic doctor. That was what I was looking for. Angelic doctor.
It's part because he's always talking about angels, right?
Well, he's the one that has established through part of his essence and existence thing about how many, I mean, why the quantity on the head of a pin is irrelevant.
Yeah. So,
although I don't see how he didn't actually study that.
Yeah. No. So I mean, first, just the point about the last chapter was sort of going on in the last chapter when we wasn't our assignment is. Another Aquinas scholar is noticing that Gilson is using terms in a way that's different from the way Aquinas used them, and he's saying, "So, is this Aquinas or is this you?" Right? And Gilson is trying to say something like, "You're right to call me on the fact that that's not exactly the way Aquinas would have put it, but I'm trying to speak to modern people who use essence in this particular way, so I have to use it kind of in the way they use it. And yes, there's some innovation in how I'm explaining these things, but it's because I'm adapting to my audience and how I think they're going to understand the terms." Now, that may be a fair defense on Gilson's part, but it leaves open the possibility that Gilson, is the actual inventor of part of the doctrine that you're getting in chapter 5, right?
Right.
Or that there might be some slippage or distance between the position that Gilson is representing Aquinas is taking and the position that Aquinas actually took. And that's kind of what the other guy is bringing up, is because the other guy is if I can put it this way, a typical scholastic ipse dixit thinker, right? Meaning he wants to know where he said it on what page, right? And he's not trying to innovate. He's trying to preserve, understand, and repeat. So the thing which is useful about people like that is they keep honest the people who are doing revisionist things. It's perfectly fine to have a different doctrine of being than Thomas Aquinas had, but that's not the same as saying that when you say Thomas Aquinas had a theory of being X and he actually had a theory of being Y, right? You can say theory of being X is correct, but that's different from saying that Thomas Aquinas had it. And so this guy is just, wondering if he can call Gilson on whether or not Thomas Aquinas had actually said these interesting things that Gilson had said. Now Gilson does a reasonable job of defending himself against that, and the guy kind of backs off after the first round of all of that. He sort of accepts the explanation if you just look at the correspondence between them. But partly they're both being polite to each other as both, Aquinas scholars who are interested in boosting interest in Aquinas generally. They're kind of on the same team. It's not that unfriendly a criticism, so to speak. But in terms of our reading of chapter 5, we do need to pay attention to how historical the Aquinas that's presented there is, in the sense of where is the Aquinas presented there, the Aquinas of 1270, and where is the Aquinas mentioned there, the Aquinas only of 1940 or something in Gilson's head, or maybe of 1830 when an Aquinas revival, put some of these thoughts back there. But okay, so that's just it's useful to note that issue is out there. It doesn't settle the issue. None of the stuff that happens in that last section settles the issue. We have to dive into chapter 5 and see what's going on between Aristotle and Aquinas and Gilson to wrestle with the question of, are there gaps or differences between them?
Right.
Okay, but so you said that overall you thought that he made sense and was summing up, but that also there were parts of the technical language which you couldn't follow in detail because it's all too intricate to follow in detail.
It was usually just one paragraph embedded in a group of paragraphs that made perfect sense down to it got there. And I thought to myself, he's really sort of slicing and dicing into minutiae here. And I was getting confused by the different labels because they were all similar, but separated enough by obvious, clear distinction. And I was missing it a little bit. And
right.
So I decided rather than spend time trying to puzzle that one out.
And that's a common reaction to it, but it also can be a sign of a place where the writer himself is not being clear, right?
Oh,
right.
I suppose.
It's
so.
You definitely in chapter 5 find places where Gilson will be going along and saying something, and he'll substitute term B for term A in the middle of a formulation, and then he'll repeat some other point of doctrine, and it'll make the same substitution of term B for term A. And then by the end of the paragraph, he's talking about term B, and it's now a completely different doctrine about a completely different term. And you sort of don't notice, if you're not paying very careful attention, that the subject matter has switched from A to B, and that the reason for the switch is not something that was there in Aquinas, but is something that's been completely introduced by Gilson. The perfect example of this is his continually injecting the term reality,
Right.
when that wasn't being used by any of the texts he's talking about. It's also noticeable in the different translations he gives to the term ousia. Ousia is normally translated substance. It can also be translated beingness in a certain sense, but it's normally, especially in any Aristotelian context, translated as substance. And what he will say, what Gilson will do is he'll say, by ousia, and he says, and then he'll put in parentheses, substance or reality, right? And then by 4 sentences later, he's talking about reality as though that is what is under discussion. And reality is not in Aristotle, but in these scholastics, a technical term, right? And it is a technical term that is carefully distinguished from actuality in particular, right? Reality, actuality is a fundamental distinction from any of the scholastics. And when you see him pretending that ousia is unproblematically translated both as substance and as reality, and that this is what Aquinas thinks of as the doctrine of ousia, right? Aquinas is not writing in Greek, he's writing in Latin, right? And he certainly isn't saying ousia, right? And he's often just saying S, E-S-S, E-S-S-E rather. But to say that this is a doctrine of reality, it's not obvious. Anyway, so my point is that if you notice some places where the technical terms seem like, I can't follow all that, but I assume that it's all right down there, right? You shouldn't always assume that it's all right down there, right? And sometimes it's gotten quite slippery. By the way, welcome, Gabriel. I hope you can hear us. I don't know if you're in the middle of other stuff. But yeah, hello.
Hi, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah.
No problem. I wanted to just quickly mention something that happened before you were on. We talked about the possibility of next time. I know we had talked about Kierkegaard for next time, but of doing for next time a different book that I thought of after our previous session, in part because of some of the questions you asked. It's actually this one. So this is Emmanuel Levinos on Husserl, and this was very early Levinos, 1930. And it's basically him explaining what was going on in Husserl and phenomenology in the first part of the 20th century to a French audience. This is what's going on in Germany that you've missed, and this is extremely influential. It's where both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty kind of first realized what was going on with Husserl and Heidegger, got them all interested in it, etc. It's also just incredibly clear. It's a very good intro to phenomenology and why what Husserl was doing matters. So I thought that it would be useful to read this next as sort of both continuity of what we're doing now and related to some of the concerns you raised. So we checked and it is available on Amazon. It's I think it's mostly available from places where you're buying it from a third party with Amazon fulfillment, so it might take a little bit longer to get it. So we might do 3 weeks as a gap to at least some time for it to arrive if we want to do this. But the reading we were talking about is just the first 2 chapters of this plus the introduction from Levinos himself. So that's introduction starts on page LIII, that is 53 of the front matter, and then the first 2 chapters after that down to page 36. But that's what we're planning on doing for next time. And we may still do the Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death, but we want to do that after this. Okay, so I wanted to mention that because you missed it. Okay, so we were getting first reactions. I'll also just say that one last thing for Gabriel, laying out what we wanted to do over the course of this thing. We want to get first reactions. We want to talk about the content of chapter 5, and especially what, just being clear on what Gilson says, what he says about the relationship between Aquinas and Aristotle, what he says about Aquinas himself, his own position and all this. And then we can worry about assessing it, right? Assessing the arguments he makes. But first, let's just be clear on sort of what he says. And then after that, we can get to the stuff that comes out in chapter 6. And then I wanted to leave some room after all of that for our assessment of Gilson as a whole, since this is our last session on him, looking back sort of broad sweep on the whole book. So yeah, those are just outline of all the things we got to cover today. And then we had just gotten into first reactions from Joe, and that's brings you up to speed. So, and I want to get first reactions from Craig, if we could, to the chapters.
I tended to agree with Joe somewhat. There was some very much word salad paragraphs that just wrapped me around the axle, and I was thinking of what I needed to do was get out and start drawing a diagram of what he was doing, because he was almost marching in circles, and I was getting lost. But I didn't get down to diagramming it, but I probably should have, to try to ferret it out a little bit more. So that was my frustration with him, to put it simply. A couple of other things that I had trouble with. His equation of to be is to act, and trying to understand what act meant by that, and how act is. I appreciate that in something like Julius Caesar acting, but I had trouble with it in terms of rock acting. So what does it really mean to act in that sense? So that was part of the problem that I sort of tried to sort through there. I think he was trying to do a little bit of separating it from potentia, but it still didn't make sense in terms of what really meant to act from some of the things that we now consider inanimate objects in that sense. Mm-hmm. So that I struggled with. Next chapter, struggled with his use of the term judgment.
Okay. That
was a difficult, not a typical use of it. I hope not, anyway, because it was saying it was a necessity of intellectualism, which really struggled with a little bit like that. And then when we get to final opinions on it, one of the last sentences he wrote at the end about philosophy leaves this gap that leaves room for religion. I thought, is this whole thing been nothing but an apologetic, for religion, even though he tried to distinguish the two? So I had a little trouble with motivation at that point. So those are the ones that I kind of went through.
Yep.
But I agree with Joe. The word salad, sometimes I was looking forward to teasing that thing out to try and make sense of it. And the same thing that you talked about with the use of the word substance, that he danced that a lot, and it was confusing as hell. So.
Got it. So there's places where we got to get into his, use of language and how much this follows and how rigorous this is, as opposed to word salad. We definitely want to focus on act and what he means by act, because he's going to tell us that the fundamental thing in Aquinas is his different conception of existence, and he's going to tell us that what Aquinas means by existence is the act that the essence performs when a being is, something like that. So we have to be very clear on what that means. The other thing to realize about act is very much an Aristotelian term, right? To be in act as opposed to be in potential is a fundamental Aristotelian distinction in both his metaphysics and his physics, right? And the relationship between essence and existence and between potential and act is very much sort of what's in play here, what's going on here. And we first need to understand the Aristotelian understanding of the relationship between act and potential, or act and essence. And we also need to understand the Aristotelian doctrine of substance, and especially the role of matter in substance. Matter is another word that's being used here in a way which is kind of post-Aristotelian. Matter means something very definite in Aristotle, and it doesn't mean protons, right? It's always a relative term to form and matter, and it depends, its meaning shifts with your level of analysis. So a classic example of this in Aristotle is you have a bronze statue, right? From the standpoint of considering the entire bronze statue, the form is the human shape of the statue, right? And the matter is the bronze, right? But the bronze itself is not matter simply, right? The bronze itself is also a form. It is an alloy of copper and tin in a certain, manner, made with a certain heat treatment and whatever else, right? And from that point of view, the bronze is itself a form that can be given to a mixture of a couple of metals and a manner of making it. And from that point of view, copper and tin are the matter, and bronze is the form. So which thing counts as the matter and which thing counts as the form depends upon the level of analysis of which thing you're talking about in Aristotle himself. So in that sense, matter and form are always relative terms in the sense of relative to the level of analysis or particular essence or thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, so we carry that all the way down to quarks now, I guess, in our modern view of
yes, things. Yes. And one of the questions that arose after Aristotle himself was whether or not there was a prime matter at the bottom of that series, right? Or matter and form were always relative to every level of analysis, sort of all the way down, so to speak. And there was always a relative distinction between them. And there were some people that maintained that there was a prime matter from which all other matters were composed as merely formal distinctions on top of that prime matter. And there were others that denied that prime matter can ever exist because they said all matter which ever exists is always already formed, right? The specifically Aristotelian position on this is that only substances actually exist. And that means that there is no such thing as matter that does not have a form. There's no such thing as unformed matter. That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a prime matter, but it does mean that there's no ability, you have no ability to remove all form from matter and be left with something which is matter alone in doctrinaire Aristotle. And that is something which Aquinas himself does not disagree with, right? Aquinas agrees that he even gets into disputes with others among the scholastics about the possibility of unformed matter. And the particular dispute he winds up getting into is with some of the Achaemite, like pre-Achaemite theologians. The question is, can God make matter that doesn't have form? And Aquinas says, no. It's as logically impossible as round squares. Unformed matter is a contradiction to Aquinas, right? But not to some of the people he's debating against. But the point is, in both doctrinaire Aristotle and in Aquinas, form and matter are always terms relative to one another that have to be composed to form a substance. And when he's talking about a substance there, because the matter and form of which it is composed is always relative to some level of analysis, matter doesn't mean the underlying all else without form thing, right? Which it sometimes does seem to mean to Gilson. And the other place this becomes an issue for Aquinas, and Aquinas in his debates with the Averroist people in particular, is are there entities without matter? Are there immaterial entities? And what is the nature of immaterial entities, right? If something is immaterial, is it a substance? Because in Doctrine of Aristotle, substance means composed of a matter and a form, right? So if to be a substance is to be composed of a matter and a form, if you have something which doesn't have a matter to it, is it a substance? In Doctrine of Aristotle, the answer is no. But in Aquinas, the answer isn't necessarily no. He allows for the possibility of there being what the scholastics called substantial forms, which are just the formal side of things without an individuating matter, but are still thought as being full-fledged existent entities. And one way to think about what's innovative about the notion of existence in Aquinas is that he wants something that can do the differentiating principle of individuation thing for immaterial forms that matter does for material forms. So this leads back to the question of, can there be more than one thing of an immaterial nature? Can there be more than one equilateral triangle? Something like that. And the Averroists before him said no, because if it has the same definition and it doesn't have material to differentiate one instance of it from another, it doesn't have instances at all, right? And Aquinas disagreed with that and thought that you could have more than one of an immaterial thing having the same definition. And what distinguished them was their existence. He thought that their existence could be distinct even when their essence was the same. You can have equilateral triangle number 1 and equilateral triangle number 2 with an index of 1 and 2 across their existences, rather than a differentiation of their essences or a different matter composing them. Okay. But anyway, the point of all that is this issue of what is the role of matter in the notion of substance in the Aristotelianism that he's starting from, and how does Aquinas change it, is very much involved here in what's new about his doctrine of existence. But it helps to understand beforehand this kind of classical Aristotelian position. In the classical Aristotelian position, matter doesn't mean an unformed bottom underlying everything else, right? Because it's always relative to which substance you're talking about. And there are no substances that don't have both a matter and a form in Aristotle. There may be ideas that don't have a matter and a form. There may be notions that don't have a matter and a form, but it doesn't become an actual substance until it has a matter as well as a form. And that means that in Aristotle proper, there are no immaterial substances. To Doctrine of Aristotle, an immaterial substance is a contradiction, right? Because part of substance means has a matter and a form. Okay, but matter in that notion is being used in slightly different senses by the different parties to the discussion. Okay, so anyway, that's something to track here, and this comes up early on in the chapter where Gilson wants to point out the ways in which Aquinas is not just an Aristotelian. And one of the first ways he wants to say he's not an Aristotelian, he's a Christian philosopher, because he believes that he thinks of things as creations. He thinks of things as existent things as having existence conferred upon them, right? And that's because, he says that this is different from Aristotle, because Aristotle always thinks that something can have a form conferred upon it, but its matter always pre-exists, right? There's no creation out of nothing in Aristotle, right? Aristotle's proof for the eternity of the world depend upon the impossibility of creation from nothing. And Aristotle thinks that in the problem of the beginning of the world in time or the eternity of the world, Aristotle thinks that he can prove that the world is eternal, because he thinks he can see something contradictory in the notion of creation of something out of nothing. So there is definitely a difference between Aquinas and Aristotle on that point. It's a difference between them on the eternity of the world, and eternity of the world and creation out of nothing are related to one another. Gilson presents that as Aristotle thinks that there is always matter which isn't created as a material cause of something. And there, the equivocation to notice is Aristotle doesn't have a notion of a prime matter that is uncreated matter from which all other things are formed. His arguments for the inability of something to be created out of nothing don't depend upon a notion of a uncreated eternal prime matter, because there is no prime matter in Aristotle. There's only matter taking different forms, and the matter is always relative to the level of analysis of what substance you're talking about. Okay, so that's just one of the ways they're kind of talking past each other. Where Gilson is right there is in saying that Aristotle is against the notion of beginning of the world in time. Gilson tends to be inclined to think that someone is believing in the world, existence of the world in time, creation of the world in time, that they are not just non-Aristotelian, but that this is somehow Christian or religious. First of all, it wouldn't mean that it was Christian because there's plenty of other religious teachers of creation in time. But second, it doesn't even mean that because all of the Platonists teach the creation of the world in time, right? It's the Aristotelians particularly that are on the opposite side of that argument. There are some Neoplatonists, Proclus in particular, who are trying to put together Aristotle and Plato, who is also against the creation of the world in time, even though he's in other respects a Platonian Neoplatonist. But most of the Platonists think that Plato is on the side of the creation of the world in time, right? And therefore don't see any contradiction between creation of the world in time or creation of something out of nothing, even in the case of someone like John Philoponus, say, and pre-Christian, non-religious Greek philosophy, right? Anyway, the point I'm making here is that when Aquinas is disagreeing with Aristotle on creation out of nothing, he is in part just agreeing with Plato on the point, or agreeing with Plotinus on the point, rather than just agreeing with revelation on the point. He may also be agreeing with revelation on the point, but the position that he's disagreeing with Aristotle about is more ecumenical, if I can put it that way. It has a wider sphere of people that agree with him, Aquinas, on the point. And this is something I see throughout the chapter. There's lots of places where whenever Aquinas is agreeing with the traditional position that isn't the traditional position of Aristotle, or even is a traditional position that Gilson himself doesn't particularly like, Gilson will not notice that it is a traditional position at all. He will treat it as something which is Aquinian specifically, or Christian specifically, or informed by revelation specifically, right? When in fact, it's part of a broader tradition that goes back to the Neoplatonists, or goes back to the Book of Causes, or goes back to all our earlier revelation thinkers, right? There'll be places where Aquinas is agreeing flat out with Avicenna, and Gilson will treat him as being a completely innovative thinker because he's not agreeing with Aristotle, right? So it's important to sort of notice those things when they're happening. Okay, but on the subject of Aristotelian substance, Gilson makes the claim that Aristotle agrees with the Aristotelian notion of substance, but then he also wants that Aristotelian notion of substance to be a completely created thing. And he presents this as being a entirely revolutionary view and synthesis. It is certainly a revolution compared to Aristotelianism, but it's also what you find in Avicenna. It's also what you find in the Book of Causes. It's what you find in a lot of the sort of consensus of the High Middle Ages, if I can put it that way, between both Islamic and Christian thinkers before Aquinas himself. Gilson is correct to point out that it is not Aristotelianism. He is wrong to think that it is that Aquinas is the only person who ever had that thought. Okay. Any questions about that Aristotelian substance thing? Okay, I don't think we've gotten Gabriel's first reactions.
So, yeah, I don't think I fully followed it perfectly. So I was looking forward to hearing
Sure.
your Jason kind of explanation, particularly about act and how like the act of knowing and the act of being relate. That seems really important to Gilson. He makes a lot of it. I don't fully understand exactly what he's getting at and why it's so impressive. So that would be something I'd keen to hear about. My favorite part was page 208, where he's talking about like existentialism again. And he's talking about like this kind of ultimately artificial separation of existence and essence. Naturally, they go together. If you separate them, then no wonder you experience anguish, nausea, and the utter absurdity of everything. And then he talks a little bit about mysticism after that, about that being the correct way to get at existence itself. So I found that very interesting. But also, going again off what Craig said, judgment. Judgment is a term that he uses. He throws it out there. I have a sense of what it means, but I feel like it has a much more technical meaning than what I think. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we definitely want to get to judgment in chapter 6. The stuff in chapter 6 on judgment in particular and knowledge are, in a way, trying to relate some of this to, if I can put it this way, more contemporary linguistic philosophy, so to speak, or logical philosophy. But the thing to understand is that the notion of epistemology and logic as being primarily a theory of judgment and of judgments about propositions, this is already traditional Aristotelian logic, right? So the idea that first of all, the notion of a proposition as something which is about a synthesis of concepts, that's straight Aristotelian understanding of logic. So you first have conceptual understandings, which are, if I can put it this way, they are replacements of things you're trying to refer to by terms that are managing to refer to them. They are reducing or translating abstract intended essences into words so that you can use words to refer to them, right? That's kind of what concepts are, right? So concepts are partly mental pictures of things, and they're partly sets of words that are translations of those mental pictures of things, or something like that. But then propositions are concatenations of concepts that attempt to actually assert something that can be true or false, right? A concept in itself isn't true or false in the ordinary Aristotelian understanding of things. It's just a picture or grasp of something, right? And if it's a picture or grasp of something which, like a centaur, that doesn't actually exist, right? That doesn't prevent it from being an accurate picture of the centaur, right? It just means that the proposition that centaurs don't actually exist means that there are certain sentences about centaurs that make actual truth claims about them that are false, right? But until you get to a full proposition, a full sentence that asserts some, attribute or proposition of some other thing, you don't have yet something which has a truth content. You just have some terms, and you have to put the terms together to get things that can be true or false, right? So the set of concepts that are put together to the point where they can be have truth or falsity ascribed to them are what they mean by propositions, right? Now, the idea of judgment here is that there is something like the mental or intellectual act that does the actual asserting of truth content about propositions, right? So my conception of the centaur isn't a judgment. My statement that centaurs do not exist is a judgment, right? So the notion of judgment is trying to differentiate when we're actually positing truth or falseness about things about the actual world, something like that. Now, there is this kind of psychological side of that, of what led you to the judgment, why did you make this judgment? But there's also an affirmative acting side of it of, I affirmatively judge that this is the case as opposed to that is the case. And it's the latter point of view which is being really involved in the theory of judgment, right? It's not why you might judge this or might judge that, but it's that you in fact judge this, right? You're actually making a truth claim. You're actually making a truth assertion. And that means that you're trying to get your conceptual machinery to not just be about words and to not even be about the particular things that those terms refer to. You're trying to get to the point of asserting actual existential claims about the world, right? Okay, so that's judgments. The other thing that's going on in that chapter, though, is he's trying to differentiate his kind of Aquinian notion of how all that logic works from some attempts in the 19th century, especially by people like Franz Brentano, to try to turn essential propositions into existential ones. What do I mean by that? All of the sum of the angles of a triangle in the plane sums to 180 degrees, right? You make an essential claim like that, and in order to understand the role of cupula terms in sentences like that, Brentano wanted to turn all essential statements into existent statements, right? So when you say that, all unmarried men are bachelors, right? Brentano would want to say that you're asserting the existence of bachelors who are unmarried men, right? And you're saying there exists an A, which is unmarried, and there exists an, some B. If there exists an A which is unmarried and there exists a B which is unbachelor, then A is always a B or something like that. That you're trying to do something where you are counting over existent things and noticing a fact about all of them. That was the way that Brentano wanted to understand universal statements. He wanted to, count over all the existent things and make assertions about which ones existed and which ones did not. And the point that Gilson is making in that chapter is that that's not what essential propositions actually are, that the use of is in essential propositions doesn't try to assert anything about actual existences in the world. In that sense, they are not, in his term, judgments. From Gilson's point of view, if you're only doing logical operations on concepts in ways that are strictly deducible from one another and are they just follow from the premises, they are analytic propositions, they are clear deductions of logic, one thing from another, you're not yet doing judgments, right? Judgments is when you are making existential claims about the reality of the external world, right? And you may have correct, essential, logical relations between propositions and so forth without that, but judgment really arises when you are asserting existential claims. And he's trying to claim in this chapter, he's kind of, in a way, agreeing with Kant that you can't derive ises from that's, right? He's agreeing with some of Kant's arguments against ontological arguments there, which do try to derive that's from what's, so to speak. And Gilson wants to instead claim that there is a kind of existential judgment involved in all actual X is claims, something like that. But that's all off in chapter 6, and it's after he's sort of laid out his whole doctrine of what he wants existence to be and to mean. He's primarily trying to link it up with the kind of, if I can put it this way, contemporary concerns of the logic choppers of in analytic philosophy, relate it back to questions that Brentano or Frege would have brought up, related to the sort of linguistic philosophy understandings of people like Wittgenstein and all that kind of stuff that was very contemporary in the period, like say 1890 to 1940, right before when he's writing. And he's basically trying to position where his Aquinian view of existence comes out on those logic questions, if I can put it that way. That's mostly the topic of chapter 6. As you mentioned, Gabriel, he also goes off at times in this existential direction of claiming that if you're not existentially engaged in things, you're sort of not really in the real world. For him, dealing with things in the life world, dealing with things which are freighted with actual significance, and not being stuck in mental abstractions, are all kind of equivalent ways of saying I'm actually making existence claims about things. I'm making truth claims about things which don't follow from premises, aren't just math, right? He's trying to avoid the notion that the purely math-like counts as real, right? From his point of view, the purely math-like, the things which just follow from the premises, is failing to engage with the actual truth claims involved in actual judgment. So that's the sort of common thread of those things of, making actual truth claims about the actual external contingent world, so to speak, is where we first are really exercising judgment. And judgment in that sense is always existential judgment, and it's not just math. Okay, so that's just explaining sort of a lot of the subject matter of 6. We can come back to some of that, but did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Before we get to judgments, though, which is kind of all on the kind of the epistemological end of the spectrum, what we have in 5 is kind of on the metaphysical end of the spectrum. Before we worry about how we think about things and how we talk about things, how we refer to things, there's just first how the things are that we would be thinking about, talking about, or referring to, right? The metaphysical version or the ontology version of what there is actually there is kind of what's being covered in 5, as opposed to how we can think and talk about it, which is being covered in 6. So from his own point of view, the stuff in 5 is more fundamental. From his own point of view, all the epistemology questions and the status of knowledge questions that he's getting at in 6 are important questions. Can all this stuff we've been talking about as metaphysics actually be known, right? But the first question is just what's metaphysically true, right? And all those what's metaphysically true, the metaphysical structure of things, is what he thinks he's laying out in 5 and showing as Aquinas' specific position on all that. So from his own point of view, 5 is more fundamental than 6, and all the stuff in 6 is meant to follow from the stuff in 5. Okay. So why is Aristotle, not Aristotle, why is Aquinas not an Aristotelian, according to Gilson? The first point is he's not an Aristotelian because he doesn't think that that the Aristotelian notion of substance and the meaning of being are completely equivalent, and he thinks that Aristotle cannot give a notion of being which completely unifies all the different all of its different meanings into a single science. And the reason he can't do that is because he doesn't understand that all beings are created, because beings are created, the world is created in time. From Gilson's point of view, follower of the revealed religions. From our point of view, that or Platonist, right? He gives this objection that because Aristotle will always see the material cause of something as being distinct from its other causes and not created, that he will never be able to unify his understanding of being into a single concept. because there'll be a sense of being in different senses. The material cause always pre-existing things. From Gilson's point of view, ruins the ability to unify the notion of being into one notion. Because for Gilson, the one notion of being, the highest understanding of being, necessary being, and God are the same thing. Okay. And this is related to the charges that were leveled against Wolff back in chapter 4. Remember when Wolff was, he said the problem with Wolff is that he puts ontology before theology, right? Here he's basically saying, by the way, so did Aristotle, right? Because very early in this chapter, right, he says that there's 3 different notions of being in Aristotle's metaphysics. First, he wants the science of being qua being in every possible sense, and then he wants to know what beings most deserve to the name of being as so understood, right? So what are the first beings? What are the beings par excellence if we have a certain understanding of being? And then the third question is, can we understand being from its causes? What are the first causes of being, right? So he basically says, and I think this is right, that Aristotle in metaphysics is after 3 different things. He wants to know what is the most formal, most general sense of being? What are the most important beings? What are the first beings or the first causes of being? And Gilson is trying to claim that Aristotle cannot unify all those things because he's always going to have this this leftover of uncreated matter. Now, what's curious about this is Aristotle doesn't see himself as being unable to unite all these things. He writes the whole metaphysics to unite all these things, right? And Aristotle thinks that what Heidegger calls ontotheology and what this metaphysics as first philosophy, as theology, does unify all these things. Aristotle is the guy who gives us the definition of metaphysics as the science of being qua being. He's the guy who tells us that he gives us the first cause argument, the unmoved mover argument. He gives us, a supposedly rational philosophical proof for the existence of a God of this kind, right? So all of the unifying these things into one science that Gilson is saying Aquinas is able to do, Aristotle thinks he is able to do, right? And the objection that Gilson has to it is that he's going to put an abstract ontology first, and he's not going to be able to understand the created nature of all beings, right? The putting the abstract ontology first that he accused Wolff of messing things up with essentialism by doing, we now see was actually already there in Aristotle, who is thought of as the opposite of an essentialist, right? He's the person who was the critic of how Plato was too essentialist, right? He was the substance philosopher as opposed to the essence philosopher, but now we find that this ontology that comes first as the most general sense of being is already there in Aristotle, right? If we didn't already know it. Okay, but the next thing to notice is that the way in which Aquinas is better than this, and the way that Aquinas has put a notion of being as the S itself first, and has put a theology that way first, is that this is Avicenna. So I don't know if this was noticeable to people, but Aquinas is more in agreement with Avicenna here. Gilson is right that Aquinas does not agree with Aristotle on this point. What he doesn't mention to you is that that's because on this point, Aquinas agrees with Avicenna against Aristotle, right? He presents it as something where Aquinas got this one right after Aristotle got this one wrong, and so Aristotle is the great corrector. Sorry, Aquinas is the great corrector of Aristotle on this point. But the correction of Aristotle on this point, if correction it is already there in Avicenna. where is this most noticeable? So the notion of God that he's using, that is that Aquinas is using and Gilson is approving of, is he says es tentum, right? What does that mean? This is on page 177. When we say that God is only to be, Deus est tentum, and then he talks about what error we're not falling into. But the point to realize is that this line, Deus est tentum, God is being itself, or being only. That is Doctrinaire Aquinas. He's quoting Aquinas, and that is a place where he could just as easily be quoting Avicenna. This is the God essence of the Middle Ages, held high by everyone down to Spinoza, of which he was speaking back at the beginning of chapter 4. It's the same God notion in Avicenna and in Aquinas. It is that God is being simply, being alone. And then Gilson's gloss on this is this: we're not falling into the error of those who say that God is universal being, that is, being taken as a mere universal, into which each and everything should be said to be as through its form. Quite the reverse, he says, right? But that quite the reverse is not at all obvious in this equivalence, right? Aquinas is directly agreeing with Avicenna, is directly agreeing with the Book of Causes. Go ahead, Joe.
I'm just curious. Avicenna was much after Aristotle. Was he?
Oh yeah, he's like 1070s in his,
so he's 200 years before Aquinas.
Yes,
right, 200 years before Aquinas.
Roughly 200 years before Aquinas, a little less than 200, but yes, 200 years before the end of Aquinas' career.
Now, did Aquinas just keep silent on this issue because of who Avicenna was?
No. I mean, Aquinas is entirely. Aquinas routinely quotes Avicenna on some of these subjects with approval. Right? He does not see the fact that he is agreeing with Avicenna as any kind of mark against him. He sees it as a mark in his favor. Avicenna is one of the premier medieval Aristotelian reconcilers of Aristotle and Revelation, to which Aquinas can refer back and say, look, here is how some Aristotelianism and plenty of Neoplatonism were put together with Revelation before and worked just fine, right? And you find that in the commentary on the Book of Causes, which Aquinas is one of the first to notice is Proclean, is Proclus, Neoplatonism. You find it in Avicenna itself. He quotes Avicenna. Avicenna, the word itself, I mean, in Arabic, it's Ibn Sina, I-B-N space S-I-N-A, right? The word Avicenna, A-V-I-C-E-N-N-A, is the Latinization of his name. He's so commonly quoted with approval by the Latin scholastics that he has his own name in Latin, right? And that's the name that is being quoted by all the Western Christian theologians, right? So Avicenna is simply one of the authorities on the divine science, the same way Aristotle's metaphysics is. If you want to understand metaphysics or the divine science, you have to read Aristotle's metaphysics and you have to read Avicenna, because he's one of the most thorough philosophers who's been over the ground, so to speak. So when Aquinas says Deus est tantum, he is not trying to be a massive innovator in the subject who is going to overthrow Aristotle or is going to replace some too essentialist understanding of being. He thinks he is squarely within the medieval consensus on first philosophy that is there in between the Latin West and the Orthodox East and the Muslim High Middle Ages, right?
What did Augustine think about these?
So the being notion, as opposed to the good notion of God, is later, honestly. And Augustine, compared to this, is more of a classic Platonist. he studied Neoplatonism. He didn't probably go all the way to finding Neoplatonism, but he was taught by Neoplatonists. The point is that in the Neoplatonic tradition, the highest idea that gets turned into the God idea is the one, or is the good, right? Not being. The tendency to make the highest idea being comes later, and it is partly under the influence of revelation, and partly under as a reconciliation with Aristotelianism, frankly, because Platonism itself would tend to put ideas like one and the good highest. In Doctrinaire Plotinus, the commonly quoted thing is that the first created thing is being, right? Plotinus has the idea of being and mind as the two first hypostases emanating from the one. So in Doctrinaire Plotinus, you have the one, then being, then mind. And that trio is what gets assimilated in the Eastern Orthodox Church with the three persons of the Trinity. That's like the typical Neoplatonic version of the top of the metaphysical hierarchy. In that Neoplatonian version, being is the second person of the Trinity. It's the second thing. It's not the first thing, right? And in part, that's because the idea of the good was put higher than being by Plato, right? And the one was put higher than, the one and being and whether or not they're equated is a chestnut going all the way back to Parmenides. But the point is, in all of that, if you're at the time of Augustine, right? The Trinity, the one, the good, are things you're going to be thinking of at least as much as being when you're thinking of ideas of God, right? But by the time of Avicenna, they've more or less agreed. That is, when I say they, I mean the people who have done all of the reconciliations between Aristotle and Plato and both those things with revelation. The theologians and philosophers have converged on this what is later called the God idea of the Middle Ages, right? Which is that Deus est tantum, God is being itself, and they're not putting a one above that being itself, right? So that is not an innovation on the part of Aquinas to have made the being idea into the God idea. That's already there in Avicenna. It's doctrinaire Avicenna. It's also there in the theology of Aristotle, which is a Neoplatonic thing in the Middle Age, in the Islamic East that probably came from Nestorian monks. And there's plenty of other syncretism that's been putting these ideas together from the late Hellenic world down to the High Middle Ages in Islam, right? And by the time you're coming out of that, you have a notion of God as the idea of being that's already traditional in Aquinas's time. It's already, the established consensus position for at least the previous 200 years, if not longer, and with tendrils going all the way back to the Greeks. Go ahead, Greg.
So I don't want to go down a rabbit trail, but I just wanted to comment that it got me really wondering why Paul Tillich went back to that in the 20th century with his ground of all being, or God as being itself. Why would Tillich go back to that same concept?
I think that he's just regarding it as something that the tradition had figured out correctly from his point of view, right? And it's to him something that he can see, this long tradition of agreement on, from Spinoza at one end to maybe Dionysius the Areopagite at the other end. But there's a tissue of 1,500 years or so, something like that long, that has that God idea, and it's one of it's not like there's a huge number of them to choose among. There's, among the philosophical God ideas, it's like one of three, something like that, right? maybe there's 6 if you ramify your types a little bit more. But it's one of the oldest, one of the most developed. So the thing which is curious to me in this chapter in particular is that there are times when Gilson looks like he's trying to present this as a innovation of Thomas Aquinas, as though he's the only guy who had the true being understanding of God. It might be the true understanding of God, but it's certainly not because it's innovative to Thomas Aquinas, right? He did not invent this idea, right? If he's agreeing with it, he's agreeing with it as a traditional idea, right? And Gilson in this chapter is inclined to make Aquinas look more sharply distinct from all of the other scholastics around him, to try to make this notion look more specific to Aquinas than it was, right? Okay. Now, it is fair to say, because Aquinas has a different notion of how being enters into the constitution of particular beings than Avicenna does, they might disagree about how they understand that God idea. If that God idea is a being idea, and you have a different conception of being, you also have a different understanding of God. That's fine. They're both saying God is being simply, but then if you ask Avicenna, what is the relationship between being and any particular being, he will say, existence is an accident that befalls that essence if God turns his face to it, right? And that's not necessarily the notion of that Aquinas has. Fine, right? They're disagreeing about their God because they're disagreeing about their being. But they're both agreeing with the formula that God is being simply. Okay. So, okay. We now need to get at, what did the Aristotelians think about substance and existence? And the critical thing to realize here is that matter is performing a role for the original Aristotelians that is getting performed by existence in, if not Aquinas, then in Gilson's version of Aquinas, if I can put it that way, right? So how does this come about? So Gilson rightly stresses that the essence of something is mostly its form, right? There's a sense in which essence and form are very closely tied, right? The essence of something is its irremovable essential attributes, right? It's a set of attributes that cannot be removed without changing the thing into something that it was something else. It's the whatness of something, right? The whatness of something, its form, its shape, its definition, right? These are all things that have been more or less equated back to Plato, right? Its definition as its outline and its form and the idea of it, right? These are all being equated back to Plato. Okay. In the Aristotelian notion, actual substances are different from just ideas because they don't just have a form, they also have a matter. They are instantiated. They have an instance. That's what we mean by instantiated. Instantiated has an instance, is actualized, and that form has been impressed upon some determinate piece of matter, are equivalent statements to an Aristotelian, right? In that sense, the essence is always a potential, but the actual substance is an actual. And this is where Gilson is right when he calls Aristotelianism already a dynamism. There's already a notion of to be in act in Aristotle. In Aristotle, to be in act is to have matter. To be in act is to be materialized, to have a material instance. So this form or shape is just a potential of things, but they become actual when they are actualized which is the same as saying when that form has been imposed upon some determinate piece of matter that differentiates it as this one of those things, right? Now, Gilson is inclined to see matter as being the least essential thing about something. It's almost a sign that the thing doesn't fully exist, that it, quote, still needs matter. That's because he's moving in the direction of these Aquinians of substantial form and so forth, who think that the less material something is, the more truth-like and eternal it is, right? The more it is assimilatable to a Platonic form that could be, true and eternally existent outside of time or something like that. Things without matter are becoming more triangle-like, if you can put it that way, right? Things with matter are becoming more physics-like. And the physics-like things are the things which change and swirl and move around on you and are, merely perceptible or something. Okay, so back to the time of Plato, to be in history, to be materialized, to be an instance, these are all more or less equated with one another. And to a Platonist, this means that it's a less ideal, less essential, less true to its definition copy, right? From the standpoint of a Platonist. But from the standpoint of an Aristotelian, to actually have matter is to be more real in the sense of more actual, in the sense of more physical, right? Things which have matter you can hit with a stick. They're not just an abstract form, they're the real form, they're the actualized form. Okay, so the point is that for the Aristotelian, to be a substance, to have matter, and to be in act are close to being synonymous, right? Now, the Aristotelians also think of the form as being more like the actual act of the thing in the following sense. The matter isn't really doing that thing until it has the form on it. What do they mean by that? The block of marble isn't doing the Athena statue thing until it has the form of Athena chiseled into it, right? Once the form of Athena is chiseled into it, it's the matter of that marble that lets that thing be an actual substance, which is doing that Athena shaped thing, right? But it is the Athena shaped thing having been carved onto it that makes it do the Athena shaped thing instead of what it was doing before, which was some amorphous blob thing, right? So in that sense, the Aristotelians say it is the form that actualizes the substance. And what they mean by that is that the essential doing the Athena shaped thing or doing the house shaped thing only comes about when the form and the matter have made it up, right? And the form is now being imposed upon a matter, and that matter makes it not just an abstract thought, but an actual existent real thing. Okay. So it is.
So where does the sculptor? Where does the sculptor fit in this?
Right. So the sculptor fits into this as in the Aristotelian version as the efficient cause who's knocking off the pieces of marble that are in the way of his ideal type, and his idea of the statue is the final cause, which is being used to determine what form it should take. Right. The form of the Athena shape is the formal cause. Right. The marble is the material cause. The efficient cause is hammering away the bits with the chisel until that form is what's left, right? So the mental conception of what the Athena shape should look like is the final cause in the Aristotelian causal understanding. And that first exists in the mind of the sculptor, right? So the formal thought and the final cause thought in the mind of the sculptor and the efficient hammering with his chisel and hammer, right, that gets away the parts of marble matter that are in the way, is what eventually realizes the statue shape, right? But the realized statue shape, once it exists, is doing the Athena shaped thing, and it's doing it. It's not just a mental picture of it. It's actually doing it in actuality. It is materially being in the world, right? It is Athena-ing from moment to moment, right? And that's the sense of the dynamism of the real in, or the dynamism of the actual in Aristotle, right? To Aristotle, it is the enmattered things which do essences in time, right? Before you've got an enmattered thing doing that essence in time, all you've got is some abstract notions, right? The abstract notions don't manage to do in time the Athena shape thing, right? They might have the Athena shape in potential, but they're not in act. And what makes the thing be in act is the fact that it has exactly become enmattered. It has become a mattered instance. Aristotle would say it has become actual. Gilson would be inclined to say it has become real, right? Okay, so that's the Aristotelian notion of how substances do the act of their form. They need matter to do it. Okay. Now, what's the problem with that if you're Aquinas? Well, the biggest problem with that if you're Aquinas is it means nothing without matter is actual, right? There are no immaterial acts if matter is the thing that's needed to be added to an essence to make it a substance, right? So this is a problem for someone who is worried about immaterial existences, like souls, like spirits, among other things. Okay, so anyway, I've explained the Aristotelian version beforehand. And what is Aquinas now going to do with this? Aquinas is now going to say that when we're talking about the existence of something, and Gilson is right to give this kind of formula, we're talking about something which is to the entire substance as the form is to the matter. What does Aquinas mean by this? So first, we'll talk about all the precedents for this later, but first let's just get clear on what Aquinas's notion is of this existence. He's talking about something which is actualizing the substance. What does he mean by this? The substance is a conjoining of a matter and a form, right? But from Aquinas's point of view, the conjoined matter and form is still only a potential thing. It's not yet an actual thing. Because to Aquinas, matter doesn't necessarily exist. Matter has to be created to exist, right? Aristotle assumes unproblematically that if something has matter, that matter exists, right? Aquinas does not. Aquinas thinks matter has to get existence conferred upon it. What confers existence upon matter to Aquinas? The answer is being itself, right? Everything which has being because being itself has been conferred onto it by being. Not just by the idea of being, but by the being to which the idea of being is trying to refer. Being, tout court, actual being. Actual being has to be conferred upon a substance for that substance to actually exist. That's Aquinas' doctrine, right? So we have something like Avicenna's idea of being itself as being something which all beings participate in a perfectly Platonic manner. And they only such things as participate in being in this Platonic manner actually are. Now, what role does this perform for Aquinas? The first is nothing gets to act unless it actually is, right? Non-existent things don't get to act, right? All the things which act do so because they first actually are. They first have actual existence conferred upon them by actual participation in the idea of being. Now, what Gilson is not inclined to notice is this is actually just a Platonic notion of participation in an idea, kind of relationship with being simply, right? So for Aquinas, a bunch of these things are deductions, whereas for Gilson, they're out of left field claims, right? Which he admires but doesn't understand where they came from. For Aquinas, it's very straightforward, right? Something which is something which participates in the idea of being, and participates in it not just with that idea being some mental thing, but in a full Platonic sense, right? It is because it participates in the idea of being, just as round things participate in the idea of round, right? Okay. So from Aquinas' point of view, a substance doesn't yet necessarily exist. There's no notion that material has to exist in Aquinas. Whether or not a material exists depends upon whether or not that material participates in the idea of being, whether or not being is conferred upon it, whether or not it actually exists. Okay. And he's going to trace that to, has it been efficiently caused by some prior actually existing being? Because only actually existing beings get to act in the chain of natural causation. Okay. So from the Aristotelian point of view, this means that Aquinas has shoved this existence layer underneath all of the stuff that they were talking about as substance, right? And everything that could be a matter that could enter into the definition of any particular substance first has to also exist, right? Okay, that's sort of Aquinas's positioning of these things. That also means that from Aquinas's point of view, something being a substance doesn't tell you that it's actual. Just because it has a matter doesn't mean it is in act, because the bronze statue might have bronzeness as one of its components, but it's not yet doing this bronze statue actually existing thing unless that bronze statue actually exists, right? The bronze statue actually exists if and only if existence has been conferred upon it by being itself. From Aquinas' point of view, this is only if the stuff of which it's composed has first been created by God, right? The matter isn't just sitting there as it would be in an Aristotelian world. The matter is first only created by being itself, right? So Aquinas is, in a way, thinking of every existing thing that Aristotelian thinks of as having matter as springing forth out of nothingness from being itself by being itself creating that thing. And any form that can be imposed upon it comes later, comes afterwards, in a perfectly Aristotelian manner, right? But it is coming onto and being impressed upon a prior existence which only exists because it is participating in being itself. Okay. And that's why Aquinas thinks that to be in act requires existence, not just substance. Okay. Okay, now we can understand the whole formula that he gives for this relationship of existence to substance is like the relationship between form and matter. Why does he say this? He's saying existence is the thing which has to be conferred on a whole substance for that substance to actually be and to be the thing that it is. And he's saying an Aristotelian shouldn't have a problem with that, because an Aristotelian already thinks that a form has to be imposed upon the statue before it can be a statue and be doing the statue thing. And all I Aquinas am saying is that existence has to be conferred on entire substances before they can be in act, as opposed to being just potential substances. Okay, that's Aquinas is trying to explain himself to an Aristotelian for whom the notion of form informing substances isn't problematic, and to explain to that person why he, Aquinas, thinks that existence is imposed upon substances and makes them be the things that they are. Okay. How is this different from Avicenna? Avicenna said that existence is something which occurs to the essence. It's an accident that befalls the essence. So the difference here is that Aquinas doesn't think it's an accident, right? It is, in some sense, happening to the substance from outside. It is a final form or something imposed upon the substance. In that sense, it is still a happening to the substance, and to that degree, he's agreeing with Avicenna, but he's not calling it an accident to the substance. Because to Aquinas, the thing only is a being at all because it is made out of already existing things, made from already existing things, is in the chain of already actual existence. Okay. From the standpoint of like later philosophy, what is Aquinas doing here? He's basically trying to separate off the entire realm that you and I would call the realm of physics from the realm that you and I would call the realm of mathematics, right? He's trying to explain what the entire physical realm has that's distinct about it, that makes it different from the merely mathematical or the merely abstract. That thing that the whole realm of the physical has is existence, right? It is the realm of relationships between actually existing things. It is the realm of the actual. Okay. Now, the place where Gilson might not be fair to some of the later scholastics is when someone like a Suarez comes along and says, oh, I get what you're saying, Aquinas. I just call that actuality, right? That's actually a better understanding of what Aquinas was about than Gilson is letting on, right? Suarez is trying to simplify Aquinas, but he's right to say that the part that Aquinas was especially emphasizing and focused on is that the whole sphere of the actual and the whole sphere of the sort of causally related to one another and the whole sphere of the existent coincide, right? He was trying to point to the existent realm and the causally necessary realm and the actual realm and say all of that is distinct from the merely possible and the merely abstract and the merely mental. And Suarez says, fine, we call that actuality, right? And that's actually a better translation of most of what Aquinas was after than Gilson is willing to admit, in my opinion. Okay. But first of all, is the Aquinian position about what he means by existence clear after this exposition, or is it still opaque?
No, it's clearer to me. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, Gilson doesn't do himself too many favors here because in a way, Aquinas is clearer than Gilson is on some of these points, right? When you read Aquinas, Aquinas is a very, it's not even that he's a systematic thinker. He's a very clear thinker. He'll give you 6 distinctions to sort everything out, right? And that makes him complicated. And you might not, follow his chain of reasoning or agree with one of his deductions at some point, and that makes him, problematic for a skeptic in particular, who's saying, how do you know this at every point, right? But what he's trying to say, he can definitely make clear, right? He's not an unclear thinker in the way that some thinkers are. By comparison, this chapter from Gilson is way harder in the purely clarity sense than original Aquinas, right? In part because he uses these words with less technical precision than Aquinas does. If Aquinas is going to tell you that something is S, he's going to be talking about the same term he's using everywhere else, right? And he's not going to, say substance or reality, and then, slip into talking about reality 3 paragraphs later. The other thing to notice here is that there's lots of things in Aquinas in this chapter, the stuff we just talked about, where Aquinas is quoting Avicenna with approval, quoting the Book of Causes with approval. These are sources which are not Aristotelian, but which are traditional and are not innovation. And Gilson, if there's one thing Gilson is most guilty of in this chapter, it's claiming that Aquinas is more innovative than he actually was, right? Plenty of things that Aquinas is saying here are, they might be new in their total relation to all the rest of his doctrines, and Gilson might be fair on that point, but they're not new doctrines about being or God compared to Avicenna, or about created being and the book of causes. Okay. The other thing that is clear to me is that there's plenty of what Aquinas is doing here, which is the ways in which it's not Aristotelian are ways in which it is Neoplatonic. And this is something that Gilson is blind to. Gilson really doesn't like Platonism, and he really doesn't like Neoplatonism. So if Aquinas is being Neoplatonic, he's only going to notice that he's not being Aristotelian, and he's going to consider it an innovation, and he's not going to consider it a way in which Aquinas is being Plottinian or Proclean or Avicennian, right? Gilson wants Aquinas to be more anti-Platonic than Aquinas actually is. That's the fundamental point here. Okay. Okay. So I think that's the single most important thing to understand about the chapter is the notion of existence that we're getting from Thomas himself. Okay. The next thing I want to point out is about this. He gives the example of light over and over again. Do people follow all the light examples or not? Joe? Joe, you're on mute.
I noticed the light example when he talks about light passing through air without being absorbed by it, but still being contained in it. Sort of interesting fact. What was another example you might mention of where he used light?
Yeah, so I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. He gives the question is the relationship of light to the brightness of air, the relationship of light to the diaphanousness of air, or the ability of the air to receive the brightness of light, right? And this is the paradigm or example that Aquinas reaches for to explain how it is that being is conferred upon the things which are. He wants being to be conferred upon the things that are in the same way that brightness is inferred upon the air by light, right? In a way, it's his participation doctrine. He's trying to explain how things which are participate in being, even though they're receiving that being from something else, right? The something else they're receiving it from is something like the idea of being or being tout court or God, right? They are receiving it and they are as long as they have received it. This is actually very close to what Avicenna calls, as long as the face of God is towards something, turned towards something. Here's the other thing which Gilson just doesn't let on at all, right? That image is doctrinaire Plotinus. It is exactly how Plotinus explains emanation. It is exactly how the idea of the good is supposed to be related to the beings. And its original that Plotinus thinks he's glossing and filling out is the image of the idea of the good related to the intelligibles as the sun is related to the perceptibles in Plato's Republic. When Plato first says that the good is beyond being, he uses the image of the good among the ideas and the sun among the perceptibles. And Plotinus fleshes that out in the Enneads to try to explain what overflow, emanation, and participation are in his whole hierarchy. It even got called the Light Metaphysics, right? So the Light Metaphysics goes back to Plato and it's traditional Neoplatonism. And Gilson gives this entire passage here without ever telling you that that's where it comes from, right? When Aquinas is giving you this explanation of the relationship of the idea of being to the existence of the beings, Aquinas is following a 1,000-year-long tradition and is not trying to be innovative at all. He is appealing to a 1,000-year-long philosophical tradition and Gilson just doesn't mention it. Okay. Why? Because the tradition he's appealing to is a Platonic one, not an Aristotelian one. No other reason. Okay. So he's right, by the way, to note that this is not an Aristotelian principle. On page 169, he's going through this whole light thing. He says, and this isn't how Aristotle would have thought about it. Well, yes, but it is how the Platonists thought about it. Okay. Okay. Fine. We got the God is only to be. Okay. Right. First cause of something is to be, being an act. So I wanted to get back to some of your questions because I don't know how much I've managed to clarify this. I knew that you guys had questions about the being an act versus potential here, right? And I want to know if I've clarified those or if they're still obscure. Is Gabrielle around? Ask this question. Sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Gabriel has been listening, but he hasn't been in.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
let Gabriel speak. I'm clarified.
Yeah, I want to know how much of what he was talking about as to act versus potential is unclear after the exposition I've just given about what I think Aquinas is trying to mean by existence.
It's blazingly clear. I'm really quite pleased.
Hang on,
nobody suspects.
Joe, I'm not asking you. I'm asking Gabriel if it's clear to him. Sorry.
Yes, it is clear. Thank you. And I think the other question I had, and this might not come until later, which it's more about epistemology, was sort of, I can't even phrase it right because I don't understand it, but the way that the act of knowing relates to the act of being, the way that he talks about it sort of makes it seem like, this is incredibly important. So
yeah, so
see if I can. Yeah.
So there's a separate thing going on at the very end of, before we get to chapter 6, very end of chapter 5, where he's trying to talk about the relation of all of this to, if I can put it this way, being in time, to temporal being, right? And this is the place where he's saying some things here which are quite far from Aquinas and look very much like his own, right? This is where he says something like, a being which is in matter, right, has to achieve its existence by many different operations which take time to unfold in order to become more what it actually is, right? And thus to actually be an act instead of only in potential, right? And he gives this whole long spiel about this, which is very far from anything you find in Aquinas, right? And what he's trying to get at there is something like the way in which finite material beings in time, right, aren't really their full essence until their entire history is complete. Something like that. He has this notion of the finite existent being as being a time-spanned thing with a whole history that only actually gets to its whole actual essence when its whole unfolding is known, right? And in that, there's this curious thing of he wants this whole unfolding history to be foreknowable to God, but to also be radically contingent from the standpoint of the being. So he first is trying to break away from the notion that something having an essence is having an essence at a point in time. And this is because he doesn't want actuality and unfolding in time to map onto one another. So in the traditional Aristotelian understanding of things, We spoke about actuality and things having matter because things that had matter unfolded in time, and this differentiated them from the math-like things, which are eternal, right? So only things which unfolded in time had a history, and had a history because they had an actualization of doing the actual, Athena-like thing because they had a matter. So in the original Aristotelian understanding, having a matter, unfolding in time, being affected by the category of time, all of those things, and moving from potential to act, those were all equivalent things that were involved in having a matter and in unfolding to a final form, so to speak. That's what Gilson points to as the dynamism of Aristotelianism, right? But all of that still had this, the essence was a true snapshot, a true time slice of an essential shape or form. And the thing which had the whole history was an existent substance, right? It was substances that had whole histories. Okay, that's in Aristotle. And what Gilson is trying to say is something like, it's the whole existent which has a history. It's Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar as the existent that has this whole history, not the essence of Julius Caesar. You only know the essence of Julius Caesar after Julius Caesar is dead and all of the things which Julius Caesar is ever going to do are known. Up until then, Julius Caesar is an unfinished thing who doesn't have an essence yet. He's got some essence, he's got some part essence, but his full essence is only known when his last act has been performed, right? And then it's the whole history that has the Julius Caesar essence. And by the way, that Julius Caesar essence that it then has is an abstraction about its whole history and past. But the thing which had that essence is the actual existent Julius Caesar. Okay, so that's the picture he wants. He wants the picture that it's the whole world line of the thing, which is the existent thing. And in a way, subspecies aeterni, to speak Spinoza, right? Only the transhistorical full history essences are the essences of the full existent things. Okay, and he is distinguishing that whole history notion from the notion of being in time and actualization that's actually closer to Aristotle himself, because Aristotle himself thinks that actualization is something transpiring in time. And he thinks things are moving from potential to act. And the potential is always surrounding the existent as a kind of, from Gilson's point of view, a mental image math-like cloud of possibilities, right? Only some of which are actualized. And the actualized one are the actual world line of the actual thing, right? But Gilson wants the existence to be conferred upon only the thing's entire history, if I can put it that way. All right. And this is related to the question he raises about Kierkegaard. He points out that Kierkegaard thinks that there's some contradiction between man as a being in time and man as something eternal. And Gilson is claiming that Aquinas destroys that distinction, right? And he makes it unproblematic that mankind is always already both, something like this. But it's not clear that he's managed to do this, right? He says at one point that if man were already a spirit, he wouldn't need a body, right? He needs the body to unfold through time, and he needs a soul that is connected to the body that unfolds through time, precisely because he is not a spirit which can endure immaterially on its own. And then 2 pages later, he'll tell you that man is always already eternal because man is also a spirit. But this is exactly the thing which Kierkegaard was calling the contradiction in man, which was that the fundamental thing to Kierkegaard is that man is spirit already. And when he's talking about soul and the need to have a body, Gilson is denying that man has spirit. And then 2 pages later, he'll say that man does have spirit. So what am I trying to say? Gilson himself is not clear on this point, right? It's clear that he thinks that his understanding of the Aquinas doctrine doesn't have the Kierkegaardian problem, but it's not clear he's gotten rid of the Kierkegaardian problem at all. The Kierkegaardian problem is man spirit, right? And by spirit, Kierkegaard means something which is eternal, something which is outside of time. What Gilson thinks he's saying is that Aquinas' solution to this problem is that all existent things are eternal, not as outside time, but as indestructible in themselves. Which means he's not thinking of spirit the way Kierkegaard is thinking of spirit at all. Kierkegaard is thinking of spirit as something not affected by the category of time. And Gilson is thinking of it as something which is affected by the category of time and endures through the category of time, but does so endlessly. Which is a very different notion entirely. Part of what is sort of in a way most attractive about his position, his explication of Aquinas at the end of the chapter, though, is this way in which he Gilson notices the fact that Aquinas is conferring a kind of participation in Godness on all existing things, right? This is definitely there in Aquinas. Aquinas wants to make clear that every being has something of divinity in it because it has something of being in it. And it also has something of causal efficacy in it for the same reason. You could easily deduce from and some Islamic Islamic people in the same tradition did, deduce from the fact that you have this whole history view of essences and a God's foreknowledge of them. You could deduce that it is only God who acts, right? And that nothing less than God actually acts. You could easily deduce that from that outside time picture of essences, right? Because it looks like, if there's anything indeterminate in this world line, that's not the essence that is foreknown to God. The essence that is foreknown to God is a particular ring of changes through this supposedly contingent history, but only one of them is going to actually occur. And Gilson even points out that these different possibilities are all things which gods can think, but God does not say everything he thinks. He say that he's using say versus think to pick out the world line of what actually is from all the possibilities that could be, something like that. But that's the same as saying, he's saying that the actual world line history of the world is God's saying. The Islamic theologians of the High Middle Ages would say that's proof that only God actually acts, right? Because the world line of the actual world line, the world line that actually occurs, is purely the one picked by God. That's not what Aquinas wants. Aquinas has a much more retail notion of being, if I can put it that way. Being has been conferred on every existing thing, and along with it, that includes the power to be effective in the chain of causes, right? God's power has been retailed to the creatures, and each is responsible in that contingent history for its acts. So in Aquinas, you get a much less, can put it this way, a much less abstractly powerful, all-commanding God than you get in Islam, but you get a participation in the power of God by the creatures, so to speak, which would strike some of the Islamic theologians as pantheist or prideful on the part of the creatures. Anyway, this is sort of the theological differences between Aquinas and the Islamic theologians that I don't think I don't think Gilson is particularly sensitive to this point, but anyway, the point is, at the later parts of the chapter, those are the aspects of Aquinas that Gilson is going through, and I think it's fair to say, again, without understanding why to Aquinas those things are deductions. To Gilson, those are positions that Aquinas lays out or takes that Gilson sees as an attractive picture of the way the world could be, but he doesn't quite see why Aquinas would think that's the way the world is. He might think that Aquinas thinks that's the way the world is because it's what's compatible with revelation, or it's what's compatible with with church teaching, or something like that. That's not why Aquinas thinks them. Aquinas thinks these are deductions. They're deductions from the fact that beings participate in being simply, right? So from Aquinas' point of view, being simply that is God is also, in a sense, power simply. All power to actually act in actuality is conferred only upon existing things, and is conferred on every existing thing to Aquinas. Anyway, that's something which I don't see Gilson picking up on, but that is definitely there in Aquinas. Questions on any of that? Are the created beings powerful, and in what way are they powerful? That's the question that Aquinas is addressing. And the William of Ockham would say they have no power because the very fact that they are is something freely granted to them by God. And Aquinas is saying, sure, but as soon as God grants them that, he grants them also the power to do everything that they ever do. Right? So to Aquinas, all of the individual beings have natures that have powers and actually act in history. Okay. Okay, were the things about the difference between Kierkegaard and Aquinas at the end of the chapter clear? This is a place where Gilson doesn't like Kierkegaard because Kierkegaard is trying to make something like true existence too subjective, right? As though it is only the interior of experience that is real, something like that. You might say to Kierkegaard, only the spiritual is real, right? Whereby spirit he means the way in which the human mind has something more than temporal about it, has possible contact with eternal truth, something like that. In Kierkegaard, the ability to have understanding of truths which transcend time is what makes the human mind spirit. In that, he's actually fairly close to Hegel. But Gilson is worried that makes spirit too much a subjective thing, because mind, subjective, and not objectively externally true are practically synonymous for Gilson. Okay. Okay. This is on 188, where he says, to identify subjectivity with existence, as Kierkegaard always did, was but to turn existence into one more essence, namely that whose very essence is to preclude objectivity, right? Meaning, to Kierkegaard, authentic truth and subjective truth are synonymous because objectivity is always less than personal, if I can put it that way. and only the personal is spiritual. Okay. I have to give you guys a chance to. I don't know if I'm to what degree I'm losing you guys, because I see the. I need some questions to make sure I'm still engaged. Otherwise, I'm going to keep flying off into these realms of extractions of what I've seen in this. Do we need to get to the chapter 6 and the sections on knowledge here, or?
So a couple questions that did come up as you were going through this.
Okay. Yep.
In giving the power, what it didn't get to was giving the free will. Is it a entirely free power that's given, or is there a catch to it? And is there a sense of conscious acting or instinct rather than instinctual acting that comes into that? Can we skate through life instinctually without ever having to be subjective or referential about what we're doing? So there seems to be a lot of loopholes in terms of just handing over the keys of acting.
Yeah. So I think that in the case of Aquinas himself, he is inclined to see quite a bit of freedom in human. How to put it? Freedom in the mindliness and spiritualness of human mind, right? But what's weird about Aquinas, not weird. What's unusual about Aquinas is that he'll give you an explanation of the relationship between body and soul and all of that, which doesn't see there being anything particularly special in man, right? It's a very embodied mind kind of thing that you could get straight from Aristotle's De Anima, right? Aquinas isn't saying that this capacity to individually act is an exclusive preserve of the especially spiritual mankind. He actually is extending it to everything that exists, even to the rocks, right? The rocks participate in the power of God when they perdure through time and keep their rockishness, right? And it may be that that souls do so more so, but the souls do so more so only as the form of a body that they're holding together, and the purely animal soul in man is as mortal as the soul of the rabbit, right? Both of them have a power to confer a living on a piece of matter, because living is something which can supervene over the power of matter as a special form impressed upon it. Book of Causes fashion, right, as a higher level of organizational abstraction on top of it. But when that organization goes away, so does the soul, right? So his animal souls are as mortal as the animals themselves, right? So this conferring of the power to act upon natures is it's not special to man. It's not as particular as you would get from later people. It's ecumenical. It's extended to all the natures and all the beings, right? And yeah, it's not. He does see there as being something in a sense abstract and spiritual about it, but it's conferred upon everything that exists in that sense. It's not special that way. Now, is there also a mind-like spirituality about mind? Yes, right. But for each of these things, what's unique in, I don't know if unique is the right word. What's characteristic of Aquinas is all of them can be true on their own level of analysis, of their own level of organization, and each of those can exist stacked upon one another in their in their great chain of being fashion, just like the different Platonic hypostases on top of one another, right? First there is matter, then there is living, then there is soul, then there is mind, right? And each of these things is a special case of an additional level of organization on the one before it, right? But each of those things needs all the preceding levels in order to exist. It first has to have existence imparted upon it, and the existence imparted upon it remains when the organization above it goes away. So this is the point that Gilson was making, that when he said that the matter of which a man is composed outlives him, right? Because it had being conferred upon it before the being as mere organization was conferred upon man as that substance, right? And that goes all the way back to the Book of Causes. It's doctrinaire Neoplatonism. So in a way, the thing that this is similar to in later thought is this kind of emergent property organization information view of all of these different, put it this way, orders of structure. These different orders of structure each have prerequisites from which they are organized, but those prerequisites do not determine what happens at that higher level of organization, right? What they do is they mean that if the higher level organization goes away, the previous levels are still there, with all of their essential powers still there, right? When a human being dies, the nature of all of the atoms in his body does not change, right? All of their essential powers are still there. All of their essential natures are still there, right? So this articulated levels of organization, chains of nature's view of things is what Aquinas is stressing. And in a way that goes all the way back to the Neoplatonic tradition. It goes back to the Book of Causes and things like that. Excellent question. I think, by the way, that
at no point,
go ahead.
At no point do they put some kind of a unique qualification or actualization on humans, or not, or do they leave it as is?
So in the case of Aquinas, he doesn't see humans as a peak of creation in this respect. He sees them as a middling thing, above the animals and below the angels. Right? They just got a position they're slotted into the chain of these natures, and there are plenty of in Aquinas's mental world, there are plenty of substantial forms that have more eternity and freedom and truth about them than man does, right? So his mental universe has plenty of towers of angels above us, below the level of the peak of the celestial hierarchy, right? So in all of that, is there still something unique about the human level? From Aquinas's point of view, only because Scripture tells us so, right? It's not a matter of reason, but a matter of revelation that there's anything special about the human in that, right? But his understanding of the metaphysical nature of these different possible levels is independent of that teaching. He first has a notion of how, matter and life and soul and mind can be towered upon one another, sort of almost naturalistically speaking, before he has any specific revelation trying to tell him anything about, levels of that beyond the human, right? He has naturalistic reasons for expecting that there's nothing problematical or strange about those different hierarchical levels being creatable out of each other, right? He already has naturalistic reasons for believing in mind and spirit and those things as these disembodied organization-like things, if I can put it that way. And I think that also is just part of the Platonic tradition. The Platonic tradition, had that view of something like spirit for reasons going back to Plato. Yeah, fair question. I think, by the way, that Gilson himself does see there as being things essentially human in this, and he is interested in Aquinas in part for his, if I can put it this way, his particular teaching about man's relation to his in-timeness and his eternity, something like that. That are reasons that those are reasons that Aquinas is attracted to him within Christian theologies, and that religion in general is attracted to him, Gilson, more generally, right? There's lots of places in this chapter where the fundamental question always being entertained is what is destructible and what is not about man, right? And it's clear when he's talking about those things that this is sort of his own motivations coming out, so to speak. But much of that is Gilson's read of Aquinas and why he likes Aquinas, rather than the things which are there in Aquinas himself. Right? I'm not saying they aren't there in Aquinas himself. I'm saying they're not things that Aquinas himself is stressing. Aquinas is not, arriving at this notion of the relationship between this or that category of being for reasons having to do with what it says about the finitude of man's temporal existence or something. Not at all.
But it still seems like there's sort of a one direction of being destructible, but not a direction of constructible or evolution within that.
Fair. There's no. It is. There is a notion. There is not a notion of evolution in it. There is a notion of hierarchies of perfection, so to speak. And this is, if you go back to the Book of Causes, there's a sort of Proclean understanding of these things in which the how to put it, the higher can cause the lower can't cause the higher, something like that. And that's not something that Aquinas is inventing. It's something which he's inheriting. From the standpoint of that way of thinking about things, evolution or emergence are ways of thinking about the higher as created from and by the lower, right? But they don't think of it that way. They think of it as if the chain of being and causation is from A to B, that means that A is more powerful than B, and in some sense more primary than B, right? So they don't think of existence as being lower than intelligence, because intelligence is created later in that chain. They think of it as being more fundamental and more powerful, and therefore more godlike, because it is earlier and more essential in that chain, more necessary in that chain. When I say they, I mean people like Proclus and whoever wrote the Book of Causes as a synopsis of Proclus, and the different people commenting on it down the years, from Boethius to Aquinas himself. It's not a if you're interested in sort of how they reason about those things, there's plenty of stuff about that in that High Middle Ages period. But it's Platonism, basically. It's or Neoplatonism. It's not Aristotelian at all. Okay. Excellent question. I want to know what else we left out here, and then there's an extra topic that I want to get to, which is our assessment of how well Gilson has delivered on what he promised that this chapter or chapters would do. Right? He was going to explain to us how this Aquinian doctrine of the real distinction between essence and existence, and the real role of existence, was going to solve all these problems that he had raised back to Plato and Aristotle. So the first question is just, does it? Wait, Joe is asleep. So Gabriel, do you have any assessments of this? I don't know if we lost Gabriel. You're on mute.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Sorry. Can you just repeat the question?
The question is, he promised that he was going to show us how Aquinas was going to solve all the problems he had raised all the way back to Parmenides, right? And all these things that were problematic in Plato and Aristotle and down to Kant and everything in between were all going to be sorted out by the correct understanding of Aquinas. I want to know, did he deliver? Did you feel let down, or do you feel like you got the crescendo that you were expecting?
Yeah, I mean, I felt a little let down. I don't think I understood it quite enough as I read it to really appreciate where he's wrong. But hearing you speak about it kind of makes me think that he's kind of bent and twisted it a little bit here and there. Like you say, like systematically kind of downgrading Platonism. So, and yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just more naturally an existentialist as well. So yeah.
So I come out of the chapter disappointed in Gilson, but still thinking pretty highly of this medieval scholastic consensus, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think coming out of the chapter that Aquinas is so different from Avicenna or so different from Suarez, but I also think that all of them have a much more robust philosophical position than you'd be inclined to think if you just got your philosophy stuff from a typical contemporary university, which tends to dismiss all this stuff and doesn't take it seriously.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was definitely informative to learn about medieval philosophy, which I hadn't done before. And sort of, Averroes, Suarez, I've never heard of. Avicenna, I didn't know anything about his actual philosophy. So yeah, it was pretty good. And then, of course, like we talked about, Gilson makes it look like Aquinas stands out as being like something kind of radically different from them. But what you're saying is that really it's he's different, but he's not like essentially different. He's part of this whole thing.
He has his own specific flavor of how he's putting together Aristotelian elements, Platonic elements, and metaphysical elements and naturalistic elements. And it's fair to say he's different from the other guys around him, but they're all drawing from very similar traditions, and they're all agreeing on many fundamental points. And they're all reasoning about things in a how to put it, in a much more clear and deductive way than they're usually presented, right? And I don't get the sense coming through all this that Duns Scotus is clearly wrong and Avicenna is clearly right. Not Avicenna. Aquinas is clearly right on this or that topic, or that Avicenna is clearly wrong and Aquinas is clearly right on this or that topic. Are there things about Aquinas' particular take on some of these things that I do find more attractive than the other guys? Sure. I think he's, there's absolutely. I mean, there's some things that he says as saying about the power of the particular natures that reminds me of some of the things we get from Averroes and the metaphysics of causation and so forth that I particularly like. I think his understanding of the God idea as in the same way as Avicenna is particularly clear, and he takes it in even more Platonic directions when he thinks of that sort of participation idea as something which is retailed out to all the creatures. I think that's very particular to Aquinas and is an attractive way of reading that. So there are things about Aquinas that I like even compared to the other scholastics around him, but most of the things that I like about him are the things which are equivalent to the scholastics around him. Do I think that Gilson has shown that Aquinas avoids all of the arguments that Gilson presented Hume and Kant as having against the scholastics? Not even remotely. I don't see a single thing about his version of Aquinas that isn't as susceptible to the Hume-Kant critique as anything in Wolff or Leibniz or Spinoza. I don't know that they are all that susceptible to those things, so I don't find those arguments nearly as impressive as Gilson seems to think that they are, in part because I've already seen them all in Ghazali. But I don't think he shows that Aquinas is less susceptible to those criticisms than these other guys are. I think there are ontological arguments in first cause arguments in Aquinas which are subject to exactly the same kind of critique as Spinoza, not Spinoza, as Kant levels in Critique of Pure Reason. I think that in the end, Aquinas's fundamental existence of God arguments are first cause arguments straight out of Aristotle, right? I think he's an Aristotelian on the point, and he just follows the Aristotelian first cause argument and unproblematically. And that's something which Kant himself thinks that he's exploded the possibility of in the Antinomies of Pure Reason, and you either agree with Kant on that or you don't. But you're not going to see Aquinas as being different on that point than Aristotle. Either Kant has shot down Aristotle and Aquinas, or he hasn't shot down either of them on that point. They're not different. So there are places like that where I think that he Gilson promised way more than he delivered, right? He promised that that Aquinas was going to be substantially different from any of the others against which Humean skepticism or Kantian criticism of the possibilities of reasoning about first philosophy, and that he was going to neatly avoid all of those arguments. And he didn't show that at all. He didn't manage to show that Aquinas is any different on the point than any of the other scholastics. And if you take Hume skepticism seriously, you're going to take Hume skepticism seriously against Aquinas as well as you did against Wolff. And if you don't, you don't, right? And if you take Kant's reasoning about the antinomies as proving that no first cause argument proves anything about God, then you're going to feel the same thing after seeing this version of Aquinas. So there, I thought he just overpromised and couldn't deliver.
I had the same sense when I got to the last paragraph of the book. He kind of summed it up that he'd taken care of all these problems. And I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, but didn't feel that way at all. And then his real cop-out when he says it provides the only ground on which philosophy can ask the question to which religion is the answer, really left me kind of thinking, well, he had an agenda here.
Sure. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this after our Heidegger stuff was to show how the problem of being had been thought of or reasoned about in an entirely different tradition, right? And I do think that in that last paragraph, he is talking about this as he thinks that metaphysics and the question of being are a question that religion answers. And I don't think he showed that. I think he showed that they are a philosophical problematic with thousands of years of history behind them and great learned philosophies about them. And if I take away anything from that, it's that if I want to engage seriously in those questions of being, I have to do some serious metaphysical philosophy, and I have to go to philosophy and ontology to address those questions. And I would not expect religion to be able to address those questions for me unless and to the extent that it was philosophical, right? So I come away thinking of those questions as being fundamentally philosophical questions. I do think that one of the benefits of this is that it does show that those questions of being have been very close to the heart of religious and theological thought through 3 centuries and 2,000 years, right? And it is useful to see people as different as Avicenna and Aquinas, saying outright, God is being itself, right? It is useful to see that, just to see that when someone like Heidegger speaks of ontotheology, he's not pulling it out of his hat, right? It's actually there in the history. right? So again, so in that sense, seeing these things as related or adjacent doctrines, I can agree with that part of Gilson, but to me that means the theologies that are worth taking seriously on this on these topics are the ones that are philosophically deep or philosophically informed, right? Anyway, that may be my own bias coming through, but to me, you know, I weigh these things by how philosophically serious they are, right?
Well, that was the same reason that I was drawn to Paul Tillich instead of Karl Barth, for example. I mean, Barth just said, take the revelation and shove it. And Tillich tried to take us back through a few thousand years of the problem that we've been dealing with. And so that, at least for me, even going into religion, it had to be something like Tillich instead of here's the Bible, believe it and shut up.
Right. Yeah. You want the philosophical meat on the bones, or it's not going to be remotely plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why Tillich became the go-to for me, coming out of other traditions that were just empty in many respects.
Okay, so that's great. I now want to, we've answered the question, or we've addressed the question, if not answered the question, of did he manage to deliver in chapters 5 and 6? I now want to pull back to the whole book, right? We've touched on it a little bit here, but assessment of the whole book, not only of Gilson, but of everything we learned along the way. What did you make of the whole story we heard? Joe?
Well, I think that the book justifies the claim that you made, or that Heidegger made earlier, that being is a concept, should I call it that? Is an idea, should I call it that? From Parmenides and up through Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that it was changing. It was becoming different, and we now have seen that demonstrated, particularly when we understand the way that the sort of ignored background of the
Question,
Neoplatonists.
is there some background noise? I'm just having trouble hearing.
Someone in my home is talking.
Okay, that's what it is.
Jason room. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's all I was. You're saying you're noticing the fact that the notion of being is changing. The idea that being has a history is plausible from this. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's fair to say there is a common problematic from Aristotle on, right? They're all engaged in something which they're recognizing as metaphysics as they try to address, you know, the problem that Aristotle raised of being qua being. And Aristotle himself doesn't present that as his invention. He presents it as something which is, you know, a traditional problem already in his day that has been addressed in different ways by, you know, the physicists and the, you know, pre-Socratics and by Plato. But Aristotle is presenting that as something which is, you know, one of the things that philosophy deals with, right? Not just something Aristotle invented. So I think that it's fair to say that yes, there are eras in all this. There's history in all this. It's also, to me, striking how much the same ideas recur, though, right? The most of the not only are most of the distinctions, most of the fights already there in the difference between Plato and Aristotle. Most of the later positions are one degree of compromise or another between those positions, right? Or there are ways in which okay, see you, Gabriel. There are ways in which bits of Plato come back, right? Aristotle's substance notion dismisses some aspects of Platonism, and then some aspects of Platonism come back. And you know, Averroes tries to, you know, bring back some of the Aristotelianism in response to some of those, you know, reassertions of Platonism. And then you get to the early modern period, and Platonism comes back in a different way, right? we get some skeptical objections to all of it, and those skeptical objections can come from people as distinct as Ghazali and David Hume, but they're the same kinds of objections in either case. And when we find that, Aquinas' supposedly unique position, we discover that lots of it are places where he's disagreeing with Aristotle because he's agreeing with Avicenna, right? So these changes are being rung between a set of poles or opposites or positions, which are not all that varied. It's not the case that there's 400 different positions here, and that all the positions are completely distinct from one another. There are many different shades of positions, but they're all kind of staked out between more or less three poles: a skeptical pole, a Platonic pole, and an Aristotelian pole. And people are somewhere in the triangle of those three things, right? More or less. Okay, so Gabriel had to leave us. Sorry to hear that, but that's okay. Craig, overall impressions of the books and summing up.
It's good to go back through and dig through all this stuff again. This was, it's been 40 some odd years since I took philosophy classes. And so it was good to dig back through this and re-ask some of the same questions. But at the end, my critique is the same that I think that you've been putting out: as to what extent was Gilson more of an apologist than he was a historian? To what extent was he trying to make a case for a particular way of looking at things, rather than trying to give us an honest historical, not just recapitulation, but a real introduction to the issues? And that's what the discussion here has done more, has been a little bit more about the issues, where they are, and the fact that they're still with us. And so, in a sense, I agree, Gilson did not quite perform, and I think fell back to being an Aquinian apologist more so than actually giving us an honest evaluation of each of the viewpoints, which we ferreted out in our discussions. So that was kind of my feeling.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
So I know that sounds a little bit negative, but not necessarily. I mean, I think I look back at some of my instructors, and they had their same sets of biases, and we were too naive at that point to be able to ferret some of them out. Yeah.
No, I like Gilson. Gilson to me is a good guide to a lot of these people. I mean, he definitely does have his own axis to grind. He definitely has his own positions on things. It is fair to say that in the end, he winds up being a bit of an apologist, not for a particular Catholic position, but for a particular Aquinian position. Even that is kind of distinct in the sense that he's not just a straight Aquinian. He's an Aquinian with these, ideas about existentialism and ideas about, Kant and so forth, which are sort of particular to himself. So he's his own flavor too, so to speak. But I also just found him a very good guide to a lot of the medievals. Even when he's attacking them, he understands people like Averroes very well. He understands people like Avicenna very well. And it's rare to find that, right? It's rare to find someone who understands that many of them. You can find someone who understands one of them, and often, because they understand that one person, thinks that one person slices bread. But to find someone who thinks that one of them slices bread, but also understands another 20 of them, right, is quite rare. You're probably not going to find someone who finds 21 of them and doesn't think that even one of them slices bread. I will confess my own biases here. I'm inclined to some of the Platonists, right? I like the Platonists more than Gilson does. It's not like I read all this stuff without having some biases of my own. I also am just impressed with the tradition and the sort of high consensus positions of the tradition. And if Gilson is looking for a place where there's one nugget in the tradition that deserves to be saved, and most of them don't, I'm much more of an ecumenical syncretist, so to speak. If I see lots of useful things in many more people in tradition, and I tend to notice the ways in which they agree in sensible ways, so to speak. So I'm more Platonist and more Irenicist, if we can put it that way, making peace between them rather than getting into war with each other than Gilson is. But it's not because I don't have my own biases. It's just because they're different from his. But yeah, I think in the end you do have to get some distance from Gilson. I think particularly his take on Hume was one of the weakest in the book. I think he's just way too impressed with Hume. I'm not nearly as impressed with Hume as he is. He still knows an impressive amount about this history, and he's got lots of other books too. And in some of them, he's just laying out his own position, and you can get sort of more sense of what's to think about himself. And in others, he's just explaining certain parts of the high scholastic period with his own view of the history, so to speak. But he's a very knowledgeable guy. He's not, as you say, he's not just an historian, so he's not going to be an objective, fair historian in the sense that he's only trying to tell you an accurate story of what happened. He's got, he's a participant in the conversation, right? So he's going to have his own takes on things and people he's for and people he's against. But I don't think you get as deep a knowledge of the issues as he has without being, engaged in them that way, right? And in some ways, the purely abstract, I'm going to give you only the fair shake of it, wouldn't get a tenth this deep on these things. You have to care about these questions to get this deep.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward. I have 3 of his books on the shelf that I'm looking forward to digging more into. The Philosopher and Theology, sort of his autobiography, which I also read a few sections of already, and saw how he's playing the 2 of them off. And then his From Aristotle to Darwin and Back Again. Looks like a very intriguing sense of that, and his methodological realism, where again we talked about how he's sort of brought up realism in a way that wasn't there in the scholastics, and so he's definitely leaning towards realism, which is my bias.
Yep. No, the methodological realism is of those books. That's the one of those I know the most. And it's a good book. I mean, he's sort of laying out his own position there. He also, the other thing that comes across very clearly in that book is he has a kind of well-formulated critique of a lot of modern philosophy, and especially how modern philosophy tends to end up going in kind of skeptical or subjectivist directions. And he's got, he has his own take on what goes awry with Descartes and never comes back, so to speak. And he thinks that you need a certain strong injection of realism to get away from some of the what he sees as tendencies to skepticism and tendencies towards anti-realism that he thinks come in with that. He thinks that some of the moves made from Descartes onward are sort of, if I can put it this way, not recoverable, right? It's like if you accept this point from Descartes, you're going to get stuck inside your head, right? You're not going to make it back out to realism. So
that was the sense I got too.
Yeah,
that's the one that I really want to start digging into, because he did spend a lot of time on Descartes with the one we just read, and yet I still he sort of shifted through him and said he's one of the root of one of the problems. But I think in our day and age, he's more than just one root of the problem. He's one of the major roots of our problems. And and I want to see some good critiques of Descartes.
Yeah, and I mean Descartes, skepticism, and even modern positivism get more of a treatment in that methodological realism book than they got here. So yeah, you'll like that book, I think. Joe, assessments of reading the whole book.
Well, I'm very pleased that we did it, because I like the tour. As I've explained in previous episodes meeting with you, that I'm very much a neophyte. I've been exposed to all this stuff, but only at arm's length. And I know all these names, but I don't know what they mean, what they signify, what they said. And so the Gilson book is very good. Now, are you saying that it was Gilson who wrote Methodological Realism? I
Yes.
believe I infer. Yeah.
Yes.
And uh, that sounds like something that certainly Craig is would find a value in pursuing. Uh, I'm just sitting here with my eyes wide open. How would Jason? The word reality
Hmm.
is what we hear almost all the time. That's not exactly the same thing as actualization, an act
Nope.
of being, is it? No.
Nope.
And I'm
And
trying to clarify, please.
so there's multiple senses of realism and reality, right? So realism, in the sense that Gilson is using it in the title of the book, Methodological Realism, he's really distinguishing it from idealism, right? Realism, as opposed to idealism, is the world is primarily made of things real things outside the head, something like that, as opposed to it's primarily made of ideas or thought-like things, right? That's the realism idealism debate. That's different from the reality actuality distinction, which is reality as a special term of distinction is really something you find in the scholastics, and the original definition of reality is something whose truth is in the things and does not depend upon the contents of any individual mind. It doesn't depend upon opinion, right? So the real is meant to be independent of opinion, right? That's sort of the original scholastic definition of it. And what the scholastics noticed is that the real in that sense and the actual don't coincide, and that there's ways in which the real is a very different idea or notion than the actual. What are some of the distinctions? So all the truths of mathematics are real. They don't depend upon opinion, right? They don't depend upon anything of that, but they're not actual. They don't happen in time. They're not, realized. They're not in the realm of physics, right? So in that sense, the real includes lots of things which we would consider objective truth, but which are not physical truth. They're not observational truth, right? Whereas actual, on the other hand, uh, uh, the word itself means that it occurs in act. It means that it's moved from potential to act. It means it's unfolded in time. It means it's an ongoing activity. It's an action, right? That's the primitive meaning of the term. And you can ask, right, are all the things that are actual real? And the scholastics of the Middle Ages notice that the answer is no. There's all kinds of things which transpire in time, which are actual, but which do depend upon opinion and do depend upon the content of an individual mind. How the color orange appears to you subjectively is actual. It transpires in time. An orange thing is in front of your eyes, and some exchange happens and your mind experiences something. You cannot convey that experience to anyone else in a way that's subjective, right? It's not something which is independent of your consciousness. It does depend upon your opinions and thoughts. So it's not real in that sense, right? It's not impersonal enough to count as real, but it is in time enough to count as actual, right? So they were fascinated by the fact that these two concepts, which have very different definitions, have a region in which they do coincide, which is the real and actual, or actual reality, they would like to say. But there's also ways in which they don't coincide. There's reals which aren't actual, and there's actuals which aren't real, right? So they were they noticed that these two things were sort of different cross-cutting distinctions, and that the place where two of them coincided was an area of particular interest. It was the area of something like objective physical truth or something like that. But for something to be in that particular area of of interest like that, it had to be true both that it was actual and that it was real, right? You don't try to do physics about the actuals which aren't communicable enough to count as real. And you also don't try to do physics and tie things up with observations if they're truths of abstract mathematics that don't have any connection to what occurs in time. So,
and the word objective then is it's not equivalent to real, is it?
It's not simply equivalent to real. It's not simply equivalent to real. I mean, the objective winds up
It
being.
is equivalent to real, but it's more.
It does. It's not
You're saying
equivalent to
it is
real.
equivalent to.
It's not equivalent to real.
Okay.
Objective originally means just the object over against the mind thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
It just means the thing thought about as opposed to the thing doing the thinking, right? And in that sense, there can be objective things which aren't real. If I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about my fantasies, right? The object of my mind is my fantasies. My fantasies aren't real, right? There's no necessary connection between them that way. But it is the case that in the truths about objective reality, we arrive at things which are about something external enough to consciousness and actual enough in time that they wind up being objects that we can share. Your objects and my objects will be the same objects if they're about actual reality, and they won't necessarily be the same objects if they're not, right? So the way in which objective truth wound up being used later, especially in subjective philosophies after Descartes or down to people like Hegel, right? Objective wind up getting used almost as a term for the actual and real, right? But that's not what its original connotation is at all. It's not in the definition of the term at all. They're just their whole philosophy is built around what they claim about the objective and how the objective does or doesn't coincide with this intersection between the real and the actual and so forth. But all these terms have their own distinct definitions, and recognizing the ways in which they're not simply synonyms for one another, they don't simply coincide with one another, was something that the philosophers have been playing with for quite some time, and the scholastics in particular were the ones who harped on the distinction between the actual and the real as two very different distinctions. Yeah, no, fine question. So I want to just quickly preface that we are going to do this, and can we talk about when? I would be able to do something in 2 weeks' time, which would be the 14th, but we could also do the 21st, and that might be better to do the 21st if that is a time that anyone can do. Craig, what is your weekend that you can't do? Would that be the 21st or the 28th? Is it the fourth weekend or the last weekend that you can't do?
It's always the fourth Sunday. So
Fourth
that would
Sunday.
be the 28th.
Got it. So you could do the 21st.
I can do the 21st.
Okay, let's aim for the 21st then, so we give people some time for the book to actually arrive. So there'll be Theory of Intuition and Husserl's Phenomenology. I'll put up the reading, but it's going to basically be the introduction and the first 2 chapters, and it'll be by the 21st.
The earliest that I saw deliverable from Amazon was February 11th, but up through February 19th. So I would be alarmed if it took as long as February 19th.
Yeah, I don't
February 11th
think.
would let me.
Yeah, if it arrives on February 11th, you got 2 weeks. That's why I would want to do it on the 21st. I would be surprised if it took to the 19th to get it. I can't imagine that happening if you ordered it now. That would be,
I think I got the last one on Prime.
Right. You have to get them from the people who are used now, because the last one that was available directly from Amazon, Craig got it. But do pay attention, not just to their condition and price, but also to their arrival date. It's fair to say. If you have one which says they'll get it to you by the 12th to 15th or something, go for that one. So you have at least a week to read it.
Yeah.
I
think I got the penultimate one. If Craig got the last one, because I got one with free delivery.
Wonderful.
Okay.
So in terms of what the amount we're reading here,
in terms of the chart
35 minus 2, 33. It's less than 40 pages that we're looking at here. And it's not, I mean, it is somewhat challenging material, but he's also, he's quite clear. He's a very clear guy. The topics, some of the topics are quite hard, but but he's very clear as people go. Things to be aware of as important topics to know about would be the idea of psychologism and the idea of naturalism. He's going to talk about those a fair amount in the first chapter or two. Psychologism, as he's using it here, is the idea that you can understand logic in particular, and scientific thought that uses logic, in terms of how the mind functions psychologically or how people think, right? Psychologism is something like the theory or claim that logic is about how people think. And both Frege in logic and Husserl in phenomenology are critics of psychologism, right? They're against psychologism. They think that if you understand logic correctly, you cannot understand it the way psychologism understands it. Basically, they're saying something like logic is trying to be a way of referring to abstract truths about the world or about reality. And if you think that it's only trying to tell you something about how empirical human minds empirically happen to think, you're misunderstanding it. That's not what logic is or is trying to be. And you have to sort of let logic be what it's intending to be, or you're not understanding logic. Right? That's sort of the position you'd get with Frege's critique of psychologism. And Husserl has his own critique of psychologism, which is related to that Fregen one, but it's also something like psychologism presupposes too much. It presupposes a whole theory of metaphysics and causation and ontology, right? That is not yet in evidence, right? That you haven't proven yet, and it's assuming too many conclusions, right? You would have to first have a whole bunch of truths to arrive at psychologism that you don't actually have. And from Wittgenstein's point of view, you have to start with things which you think from logic and reason logically about the contents of your experience before you could arrive at any position from which psychologism could appear plausible to you, right? He thinks that psychologism is a species of the cart put before the horse, or all the problematic conclusions being assumed to come out one way without evidence, right? So the related issue is naturalism, and naturalism, as he uses it in chapter 1 or so, is something like it's partly the theory of existence or of ontology that he thinks that psychologism has, but a better way of thinking about it is when he's thinking of naturalism, he's thinking of something like there's a school of logical positivists around his time that believed that only scientific knowledge is genuine knowledge, and scientific knowledge, genuine knowledge, empiricism, skepticism, and materialism are more or less equivalent to one another, right? That notion is something like what he means by naturalism. He means the positivist critique of the possibility of any truth that isn't scientific truth, along with the belief that scientific truth is logic plus empiricism, and that logic plus empiricism issue in something which is like a skeptical materialism, something like that. That whole tissue of notions is getting reduced to a shorthand here of naturalism. He will use naturalism in a more precise, defined way than that. But to just understand what he's even talking about when he says naturalism, that's the sphere of ideas he's talking about, right? He's thinking about that kind of view of what knowledge is, right? The question is, what is genuine knowledge and what is scientific knowledge? What is genuine knowledge? And naturalism is a claim that genuine knowledge is the knowledge that you have after you make all of those, to Wittgenstein, all those very problematical assumptions, right? And Wittgenstein would like to know, what is the evidence for all of those assumptions? right? So yeah, so the point is to Levinos will tell you that naturalism is a philosophical position that Husserl considers himself as being a critic of, right? So it might even be a straw man position. It may be an ideal type position. There is a position that Husserl thinks that he is shooting down or arguing against, that Husserl himself has constructed as the position that he thinks he's attacking, and that position is naturalism, right? So just to be clear on what psychologism and naturalism are referring to going in. Anyway, that's enough orientation towards sort of what the topics are. Obviously, we care also about where we're going. You know, what is this phenomenology business? What is intuition? What is the role of intuition in phenomenology? What is Husserl's method? What was Husserl doing in the first place? Why do we care about Husserl? How did he found phenomenology? What's the core idea, right? All of that is sort of what the whole book is about. And I find it valuable because it's a very clear exposition of sort of how phenomenology branches off from the rest of philosophy around the late end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. How does philosophy come out of concerns about the foundations of logic? How does it come out of, you know, neo-Kantian understanding, you know, critiques of scientific understanding? That whole sort of philosophical milieu where continental philosophy and how do you put it this way, Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy kind of break off from one another and diverge. This is basically the point where they branch, and this is going over the reasons why they branched, right? And Husserl is the guy who causes that branching, and Levinos is just going to explain why. So anyway, I think it'll be good, and we'll do that on the 21st, same time, and I'll put this video up later tonight, and thanks everybody. This was good. Any final comments? Craig is shaking his head. Joe is on mute. All right. See you guys next time then. Thanks.